It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Craig Kapitas is contributing editor to The Daily Beast. How are you, sir?
Okay, mon capitaine.
With us as well, Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time Magazine. How are things?
Very good.
Very good.
Kind of.
Kind of good. Oh, I'll stop asking. France 24 senior correspondent Elena Voloshin. How are things with you?
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Like at war.
Okay. We'll be talking about that war in a moment. We're with as well journalist Joseph de Weck, Swiss journalist, author of Emmanuel Macron, the Revolutionary President. We'll see if he's revolutionary when we talk about his new cabinet a little bit later on. How are you?
Sure, very good. It's Friday evening.
It's Friday evening in Paris. By the way, please tell your friends to listen and like The World This Week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other fine streaming services. Nearly 3 months after the invasion of Ukraine, Russia finally sealing its first major trophy. Haggard Ukrainian fighters surrendering from Mariupol's last pocket of resistance. Long after the Azov seaport was overtaken, they had kept control of the Azovstal steel mill compound, at one point pinning down an estimated 12 Russian battalions. Now that the fighting's over, Moscow's focus turns squarely to the eastern Donbas region. Craig Kapitas, I know it's important symbolically, but in terms of the war, is this an important moment?
Yeah, it shows that the Russians are in it for the long haul, that the Ukrainians, bless them, are winning the TV war, but, you know, TV wars don't have artillery. The Russians will keep pushing. The Russian military is very good at blowing things up. And Vladimir Putin doesn't care whether he destroys everything in the Donbas, if he turns it into a parking lot or a sewer. That's not important to him. He just wants to show his control and his power. So this is going to continue.
This is going to continue, you say. Elena Voloshin, I know it's all Mariupol all the time right now on Russian state television.
Well, at least it's that they say, and they want to present the Mariupol surrendering of the soldiers like the ultimate victory, because they obviously have no more victory to claim. But this surrendering of the Ukrainian soldiers is like very much shown on Russian TV. Like, look, this is even the fall of Ukraine. They mix up the two things, like the Azov battalion and Ukrainians. Like they say, the myth of Azov battalion is falling down, is destroyed, and then it means like Ukraine today is a fake. The country is destroyed, is losing the war, and etc. That's the Russian narrative that I hear now from state TV.
Let's listen to a clip from Russian state television.
Azov
was created as a super brand, as part of the Ukraine brand. In terms of the dismantling and desacralization of the Azov brand as a group of supermen, as something that's the embodiment of Ukraine itself, it's the start or the pursuit of the destruction of this myth of a greater Ukraine that was redefined over the past 8 years.
That's the presenter wearing that the Z T-shirt?
Yeah, he alternates the T-shirts. He has a Z, a V, and an O, which are actually the initials of Volodymyr Alexandrovich Zelensky. So nobody knows from the beginning what does these Latin letters mean, as Russian alphabet is a Cyrillic alphabet, but he always wear either Z or O or V. Like any propagandist on Russian state TV, he openly supports the special military operation, as they call it officially in Russia, of denazification of Ukraine. And that's what he was saying. I mentioned that earlier, that like the fall of the Ukrainian battalion, and you see, you hear like he's really even insulting, and that's just a pure hate speech. He delivered like 23 minutes of it in the opening of his great and very followed TV show, and all this TV shows have replaced any other entertainment programs on Russian state TV, because it's all about like zombifying the Russian opinion and alienating them to the special operation by this kind of hate speech, which like says Ukraine is not a state.
Ukraine's a fiction.
Ukraine's the fake. He says like properly that Ukraine is a fake. He said that. That's what he said. I'm not like that's what you can hear from because he said, you see this battalion, it's like it's nothing. They pretended they are heroes, but they are nothing. Look, they look like nothing. They are nobody. And like this is Ukraine today. This is just a fake. This is just a myth. That's what he's saying. And it's kind of it's the purpose of it. It's to give a psychological war. You know, like to defeat the enemy, to give him no chance to fight any further. And in the eyes of Russian population and of Russian public opinion, it's like if Russia was winning the war.
And it works.
And it works.
Mm-hmm. So much so that the New York Times, in an editorial today, came out and suggested that the Ukrainians give up land for peace. That's how it's working.
Vivian Wall?
I mean, I just wanted to pick up with what Craig said before, and that is, clearly, Ukraine is winning the TV war. They've won the world's hearts, except for, China, of course. And but on the other hand, as Craig says, Russia is in it for the long haul, and they have their population solidly behind the war. So at what point, and I think this is really going to come down to the crucial factor, at what point does the West begin to fracture over this war? Right now, there's unity, extraordinary bipartisanship in Washington, which just passed this gigantic aid package, military aid package to Ukraine this week, which is great. But the fact is that the global economy is headed most likely for a recession. There's a massive global food crisis. There are all these things looming on the horizon, this kind of tidal wave about to break over us. And I'm just not completely convinced that the West can hang in there for the long haul in the way that the Russians can.
All right, you're not convinced the West can hang in there for the long haul. There was an outlier on Russian state television this week, not convinced that the Russians can hang in there for the long haul. A retired colonel on Russia One's flagship current affairs program, 60 Minutes, warning that the Ukrainians are motivated, they can mobilize 1 million soldiers, and have the military supplies Viv was just referring to about to pour in from the United States as well as the European Union.
We need to treat this million Ukrainian soldiers as a reality in the nearest future. We need to consider this in our strategic calculations, that the situation for us will clearly get worse. The biggest problem with our military and political situation is that we are in total geopolitical isolation, and the whole world is against us, even if we don't want to admit it.
How did you interpret that, Josef de Vec?
Well, I think he's making an important point is, yes, that Russia is in there for the long haul, but in order to maintain your position in advance, you need military equipment, you need an economy to support it. And at some point, you also need a population that is not only standing there as a bystander, but potentially also participating as in troops coming in. And this is a serious constraint for Putin. He has so far not mobilized the population to, enter the war. There's no mobilization of troops. And he's having troubles already with arms equipment. And on the other side, you have Ukraine, who now gets all the weapons more or less it needs and is fighting on its own land, so has higher morale. So in a sense, I would say we've always underestimated sort of the resolve of Europeans and the US in this war. And I think we're there for the long haul as well. I think it's really hard to imagine a scenario where in 2-3 months, because of oil prices and inflation, we suddenly say, stop it, and we give Ukrainians to Russia just to get lower oil prices.
I have to say just one thing. Just off what Joe just said, is I was just in Ukraine, and one of the most absolutely striking things is the total conviction that they will win. I mean, it doesn't matter who you ask. It's not even a question in people's mind. And that is a factor of morale. Everybody is involved. Everybody's volunteering in some ways. I met, CEOs of major companies who are on the front line It doesn't matter who you are, you're somehow involved.
All right. Earlier, both of you said that the Russian propaganda machine is working. But what is the aim of that Russian propaganda machine, and how do you explain this retired colonel popping up on television?
The retired colonel, it was just like a small voice within the huge orchestra of hate speech propaganda style that you heard at the beginning. So like this is really an exception. But just to answer your question,
but
and
is the aim, because Josef Devek was talking about...
The aim of propaganda is clearly to mobilize Russians, to make them stand up from their sofas and go to fight in Ukraine. But that is like the real difference between propaganda and what happens in Ukraine, because propaganda creates this like fake bubble of support. You have to analyze it through the prism of the creation of public opinion within a totalitarian state. Like it's not sincere thinking. It's not what Russia really sincerely feel and think. They think they feel and they think they think it. So like the whole, you have to place it within the context of this tradition of collective, mobilized, massive speech, like everyone speaks the same voice, everyone is behind the leader, like we are in a totalitarian state, like who went back in the USSR style propaganda. So the people, yeah, they at the level of the dogma, they do support the dogmas, they do support the ideology, but it doesn't go beyond that. And if you like scratch this level of ideology, of propaganda behind it, if you start really talking to people, yes, maybe they could change their opinion. Or, I mean, not talking about the very aggressive ones, because they are like really feed with this hate speech and it goes too far. But it doesn't go to the point where people really want to go and fight. There are some volunteers. I know even within, for example, the small villages in Buryatia, I was speaking to people and they say like there is a village, 2,000 inhabitants, 120 soldiers died, and the other ones, they want to go and to revenge them. You don't think like the mothers are saying, no, this is horrible, this war is horrible. This is the Russian style thinking sometimes. But on the other hand, the massive Russian population, they have just other priorities. They have very poor level of life. They have low pensions. They don't have nothing to feed their children. So like they would not, yes, if you ask them, they will say, yes, we support Putin. They will go outside with the Z and etc. Like to show this this level of support. But in the very deep understanding, they will never go to find you. Really have to place a gun on their heads. It's so as they go in Ukraine. This is not a sincere. This is a fake.
You agree, Krakapis, the propaganda is enough to rally support around the leader, but not enough for people to go pick up a gun.
I disagree with the whole analysis, except for one thing you said, which I thought was wonderful. This colonel, he's but one instrument in a large orchestra. And you're right, but he's the loudest instrument in the orchestra right now. Back in the day, start with the premise, no Russian government has ever been overthrown without the intervention of the army. That is a historical fact. Back in the 80s and 90s with Yeltsin and during Gorbachev, you read Krasny Vezda, Red Star, which was the Russian military newspaper, to see articles or opinions written by fellows like this colonel. That stopped. This is very significant because this is the first time we've seen a Russian military officer go on television and say, wait a minute, folks, it's significant. What happens next, who knows? But he didn't go on there on his own. There were other senior military officers who he spoke with. I don't think they let anyone at 60 Minutes or at Russian Broadcasting know what they were going to do. This is how it was done back in the 80s and early 90s. And I think that we saw a replay there, and I think it's exceptionally significant and something to watch.
But have you watched the whole TV?
Yeah, I did. I saw how they came down on him afterwards, which is what happened back in the old days in the late 80s, going up to the first coup attempt with Gorbachev. You know, no one knew if the military was going to get behind Yeltsin until the tanks actually got up to the White House.
There is a split in the elite. There is also a split in the Putin very close circle, I think. But still, propaganda is still as massive in Russian.
Oh yeah, it is. he's spouting propaganda, but that's the kind of propaganda I think the Ukrainians want to hear.
And Vivian Walt talking about how the Ukrainians are winning the information war with the rest of the world, or a good part of it. In Kyiv, Ukraine's first ever war crimes trial, a Russian soldier pleading guilty to the shooting death of a 62-year-old civilian on a bicycle near the eastern town of Sumy. That was in the opening days of the war. The trial including a poignant exchange between the victim's widow and the 21-year-old sergeant.
Do you repent the crime you committed?
Yes, I plead guilty. I know that you will not be able to forgive me, but I apologize and ask forgiveness for all I have done.
He had a shot to the head. I ran up to him, and the skull was pierced.
Vivian Walt, our correspondent in Kyiv, telling us how the widow, she is in favor of that soldier being exchanged for one of the Ukrainian prisoners of war.
Well, I imagine, and I have nothing upon which to base this, but I imagine that one reason why this trial was rushed through like this, I mean, it's the fastest moving war crimes trial we've ever seen, has to be because there's a possibility of a prisoner exchange. And there's a whole lot to exchange. I mean, there is, all the soldiers that are now prisoners of war who have come out of Mariupol from the Azov battalion, and many others. And Ukraine, too, has many Russian soldiers who've been taken prisoner during this war. So I think it's something quite sort of hopeful about the fact that there is at least a little crack in what's just been this grinding battle that's been going on for nearly 3 months now. There is a sort of little sign that there could be some kind of negotiated exchange, at least.
A negotiated exchange, but of course no end in sight to the fighting, and that has prompted countries that had stayed neutral throughout the Cold War to take a side. Helsinki and Stockholm this week officially applying for NATO membership. The Finnish president, the Swedish prime minister rewarded with a red carpet treatment at the White House. But it's not a done deal. What with surprise blowback from one precinct.
At the moment, we are absolutely concerned about these two countries, especially Sweden, which is definitely a focus of terror, a home of terror. They also impose sanctions on us regarding weapons.
A home of terror, Josef de Vec. There are Kurdish militants who are political refugees as well. In Sweden, I guess that's the reference there, as well as the fact that Sweden stood up when there was Turkey that took on Kurdish militias in Syria that were fighting ISIS. Your reaction to Recep Tayyip Erdogan drawing a line in the sand?
Well, NATO is basically a security alliance, and he considers Kurdish militias or the Kurdish party in his country to be a security threat for himself or for the Turkish nation, however he sees it. And there's a big debate in Europe about whether this is the case. There are some countries who label them as terrorists, other not. And he's trying to use that opportunity, like other autocrats are doing it. We think about Viktor Orban, who's using decisions where unanimity has to be taken to get his goals across. And he's using that opportunity now. And he is sure that Sweden and Finland, but also the US, will have his ear. So there will have to be a compromise to some extent. It will have to be negotiated by Stockholm and Finland. But it's his maximum point of leverage, and he's trying to use it.
What does Erdogan want? Is it really about Kurdish militants?
No, as with all strongmen, anyone he sees as a threat to his regime is a terrorist. This is how Erdogan is operated. He's the Joe Manchin of NATO.
So it is about the Kurds.
It's not just about the Kurds. It's about anything he doesn't like. It's about women. He doesn't like women, so he.
But no, this is about NATO here.
It's about everything. You have to look at Erdogan's rules since what, 2 or 3 in a totality. He's not a very nice chap. He's not a Turkish delight. He got angry because the U.S. wouldn't give him the
These fighter jets.
Yeah, the jet fighters, the F-35. And the reason they didn't give him the F-35s is because he went out and spent over $2 billion to bring in sophisticated Russian anti-missile systems. And the Americans said, sorry, pal, that ain't going to happen. And it's not just because of the missiles. It's because when you bring those missile systems in, you also bring Russian technicians. And NATO didn't want those guys wandering around on NATO turf. So now Erdogan's saying, well, we'll take some parts and some other jets instead. But the U.S. Congress isn't going to give it to him because they don't like his human rights record. They don't like what he's doing with these SS-20, and he's doubling down. So the question boils down to this. Who does NATO need more, Tayyip or the Finns and the Swedes? And it's the Finns and the Swedes. The problem NATO has is there's nothing within the NATO treaty that allows them to kick anyone out. It's real difficult. So, so a lot of observers say, well, Tayyip will cave in. But what does he want? He's not going to get what he wants. What, he's going to ask for a cash payment to prop up his bogus economy? I mean, who knows?
So when Recep Tayyip Erdogan says Sweden, he means his differences with Joe Biden?
I think he means essentially the West. And, Craig made a very good point, and that they can't kick him out. And it's very much the same issue as the EU has, of course, with Viktor Orban. There's nothing in the EU constitution which allows him to kick him out. There's one very important point here. He needs NATO because since the 17th century, the Turks have fought 12 wars with Russia, and they lost 11 of them, and they're really bloody. He might have to trade with them, but he's no longer a border state now. It's Armenia and Azerbaijan. But he's still scared of Putin.
Elena Voloshin, this is one of the crazy things about this whole conflict is it's really thrown into the spotlight. Viv was talking earlier about food insecurity, how much the Black Sea has become this focal point for the whole planet.
Actually, for Russia, it is very important. But we even remember that before annexating Crimea, Vladimir Putin was pretending that NATO would want to have its bases in Crimea, which is totally insane because even at that time, even when Crimea was actually Ukrainian, he would have up to 25,000 soldiers within Crimea, according to the treaty that was signed with Ukraine in 1997. So clearly, From my perspective and having covered the annexation of Crimea, I don't think like at any time there was a real threat from NATO coming to Crimea and invading like Russia.
Now they're talking about one of the plans that was floated this week was to have military escorts for ships that would take grain from Ukrainian ports?
No, that the Azov Sea, I can talk from a Russian perspective, and I can say that instead the Azov Sea really is a strategic target for Russia, that they really planned to make this south corridor to Transnistria to occupy all this south part of Ukraine. Now, the question from a Putin's perspective is just, does he have the military means of his ambitions? But clearly, there was a Russian ambition to control the whole part of this Azov Sea.
Recep Tayyip Erdogan holding up Sweden and Finland's NATO applications, while Hungary's Viktor Orban holds out, as Josef was saying, against an EU embargo on Russian oil. The recently re-elected Orban is still haggling, all the while bashing Brussels with gusto, like when he welcomed U.S. conservative lobbying group CPAC to Budapest this week.
Progressives are threatening the whole of Western civilization. And what is really dangerous is that it's not happening from the outside, but from the inside. Dear American friends, you are dealing with the United States. We're dealing with the European Union. They want to abolish the Western way of life that we love so much.
They want to abolish the Western way of life. Sounds like a great replacement.
Yeah, it's really quite striking. The Great Replacement is a sort of theory that originated in France. There's this French far-right writer, Renaud Camus, who has popularized this term, and it has made a world tour, and it's now all over the place. And it's a complete conspiracy theory. It has a long history also before the Great Replacement. Always sort of the far right always thinks about the enemy from within. That is the danger. That has been the case in history always. And it's a great figure if you want to mobilize people, but you don't have any arguments.
So Viktor Orban can say stuff like this before Donald Trump supporters in Budapest. And then, next week he'll go and negotiate that Russian oil embargo over in Brussels.
Orban has always, in his nearly, 10 years he's in power, he speaks one day one thing, and then the other day he goes to Brussels and negotiates some kind of deal that gets him benefits on the other. He's a very able sort of tactician, and he speaks to a political public, but at the same time he knows he's in the European Union. He needs them. Around 4 to 5% of its GDP run on EU funds. But yeah, what is really scary is that this French concept has made the tour of the world. It's big in the US now as well, as we've seen, and it's a complete bogus concept.
So Viktor Orban needs the EU the way Recep Tayyip Erdogan needs NATO, and they're both at loggerheads.
Absolutely. I mean, if you drive around Hungary, I mean, it's just every single town you see is just filled with these, signs outside every public building, paid for by the European Union. And it's just completely absurd. But they've been essentially saying this line for many years, that Europe was headed towards, losing its Christian distinctiveness. That's been one, thing that they've been saying repeatedly since the migrant crisis in 2015. And I think what is so astonishing is that here you have the American conservative establishment in Budapest.
Establishment.
CPAC?
Yes.
Yeah,
establishment
for sure.
is the key
That
word.
Is,
it's a waterfall of hate.
Yeah.
And they're going to the source, and they're going to bring it back.
As it was, with Steve Bannon during Trump's initial election campaign, was Steve Bannon was always in Budapest. Thought it was a wonderful model.
They're very good at picking at the scabs of hate that go back to the founding of the U.S., to the founding, these racist original sin scabs. And it used to be that we kind of thought as journalists, well, if we put them on TV, on talk shows and whatever, these characters, we'd expose them. Well, they did a Houdini on us, okay? They took it over. They're now use these shows to burnish their image and sell their product. And it's now baked into the culture.
And Elena Volucci,
about hate speech, what's interesting is that in Russia also the great replacement theory is a mainstream now. And Vladimir Putin and his propaganda always talk about the great replacement of Russian traditional patriarchal values by the West ones. And I even hear Russians saying that if we were not bombing Ukraine, I mean, they not said bombing, but leading the special operation, blah, blah, in Ukraine, then if we wouldn't do that, then tomorrow we would have gay pride like all over in Europe and in the United States, all over our streets, and we don't want these values. We want to preserve our Russian world and blah blah blah. So it's a mix of everything, like denazification, de-Westernization, de-gay, whatever. But we want to be like the Russian world. We want to build this world. We don't want Ukraine to go towards the West, Then we want them to be with us within this traditional world. And they even talk about the third world civilizational war of values, like the so-called war that the West is leading against Russia is to replace Russian traditional values, and that's why.
The Great Replacement conspiracy theory at the core of the manifesto of an 18-year-old who live-streamed the mass shooting last weekend targeting blacks at a Buffalo supermarket. The U.S. president came to that northeast U.S. city on Monday to comfort families and call out to domestic terror. White supremacists and those who enable them, he said.
Look, the American experiment in democracy is in a danger like it hasn't been in my lifetime. It's in danger this hour. Hate and fear are being given too much oxygen by those who pretend to love America.
Who's he referring to, Craig Capitas?
I'm tired of it. Tired of his speeches. These people, this guy, he went in and he shot people because they were black. At the Tree of Life Synagogue in my hometown, Pittsburgh, this guy went in because he was inculcated to shoot Jews. They're being shot for what they believe in for absolutely no reason whatsoever. But Mr. Biden, we're always walking down a new path towards the future.
Well, he called it domestic terrorism. He talked about white supremacists.
Yeah, and they did that 3 months ago, or last year at Tree of Life, and they did it 2 weeks ago when the last one. There have been 222 shootings like this so far this year. We're always going down a new path. Nothing ever changes. And then someone, of course, will get up and say, you know what? This is not who we are. Well, maybe it is who
is he
we
referring
are.
to when he talks about those who pretend to love America? Vivian Walt, is that the pundits on Fox News? Is it his Republican opposition, which might win in November? Is
hard to tell the difference, really, at this point. I mean, I think what's so disturbing for those of us, who call the U.S. home in some ways, what's so disturbing is just the erosion of normal, moderate, kind of consensual way of life.
Precisely.
And it's almost hard to wrap one's head around it. It's happened suddenly. I mean, he says not in his lifetime. That's what President Biden says, which is quite a long time. He's nearly 80 years old. But in fact, it seems to me within just, I would say, 5 years, 6 years, there has been such a radical change that I don't think we've really begun to grapple with the consequences of
They
it.
can't. It's very difficult. If you go back to the 38 project, if I get the year right, that the New York Times did, when they arrived, when the Europeans arrived in Virginia, the white Europeans, there was a boat of black slaves with them. So African Americans, black Americans, were there from the very beginning. These are not interlopers. They're Americans. And this was supposed to have changed during the Civil War, and it didn't. It was supposed to have changed with the Voting Rights Acts in the late 60s under Johnson. It didn't.
So, Joseph Devek, if the Republicans do win those midterm elections in November, and the odds favor them so far, how mainstream will these opinions go?
I mean, a good example is if we look at France. In France, these opinions have to some extent really managed to enter the mainstream. If we think about Valérie Pécresse, who was the candidate, of the center-right Republican Party, she used the phrase of le grand remplacement, the great replacement, in one of her key speeches. Marine Le Pen, Éric Zemmour, they have used it as well. People say it on TV shows as if it was a fact. And I mean, in reality, it's just very easy to show. There is no such thing as a great replacement. There is no conspiracy of people organizing immigration to get rid of people. And you could just confront it. But the fact that you can say this as a politician and it can then become a subject of debate as if it was a subject of debate.
So where are the politicians
that it is
globally?
already mainstream.
This is what I don't get. We got 4 people sitting around a table here. We know this. We don't have any power. Joe Biden saying, let's pray for these people. Everyone will. It's going to happen again. The right wing has taken control of the message. And the Democrats, at least in the States, thank God Macron has not allowed that to happen here. Thank God. But this is what's going on. We're going down a path. Well, what's the use going down a path if you never get to the end of it?
I mean, that's the difference between U.S. and Europe. In Europe, Macron's election, to some extent, has shown that, there's a limit to this. There are still 58% of the French who have voted for Macron, even though many of them hated, but just because they didn't want Marine Le Pen at all. That's quite a strong statement. But in the US, the society is so polarized that it's 50-50. And so the situation is much worse.
Speaking of Emmanuel Macron getting re-elected, now he's got to win the legislative vote next month. Can he renew himself? This week, the re-elected president renewed his team, changing prime ministers before the naming this Friday of a new cabinet. They'll be answering to 61-year-old Elisabeth Borne. She was labor minister under her predecessor, France's only other female prime minister. Socialist Edith Cresson lasted but 11 months in the job before she was forced out way back in 1992. And in those images, we're seeing it in an evolution from Monday, where you had the handover ceremony between Elisabeth Borne and Jean Castex. She gave a nod to Edith Cresson, who, by the way, wished her bien du courage, which is French for lots of luck, you're going to need it. And then she dedicated this to all the little girls out there. In 2022, how do you feel about the prime minister dedicating the fact that she's named to all the little girls?
Are you asking me because I'm the younger speaker here? Look, I know there have been a great debate about this. I don't have any clear opinion because, I've been just 10 years in Russia. I come from a parallel reality. So I need way much more to shock me, So I don't, that's not the kind of,
is it a moment to be only the second female prime minister? Is it a moment to be feted, or is it a non-event?
I think from my perspective, it is a non-event. I mean, I'm always asking, I was at war as a reporter. I did very difficult stories, and I'm always asking, so how is it to be a female reporter and so on? I don't see the point. I'm a reporter, that's it. I do my job and that's it. So, but maybe there is someone who it speaks to. I'm not sure.
Vivian Wall?
I would agree. It's a non-event. I would be more impressed if there was a prime minister of color, say, or even a few more faces of color in this new government. In the year 2022, to have a female prime minister, I mean, it's shocking that so much time has passed since the last female prime minister. But there's nothing to suggest that Elisabeth Borne is any different from any other member of cabinet. It's not like she comes from a wildly different background. She's a
technocrat who went to all the right schools.
Exactly.
So that's the question then, Joseph de Weck. When you look at the list of this cabinet, how's it any different from the previous one?
Not much. I think it's. Elisabeth Borne, she's been there for the last 5 years. I think she was
environment minister.
Environment. She was
transport and labor ministers.
Yeah. So she's been there for a while. Before, she's also been, the head of RATP, so the public transport organization in Paris. So she's clearly a very competent person. I think she has an interesting biography in a sense that she really comes from not a privileged background. Her studies and her whole school was paid by the state at the time. So she's a good example of this méritocratie républicaine, sort of this idea that you can rise through the ranks through the school, something which is very much in doubt today, if this is still possible. And this is one of, key themes for Macron, for France as a country in general. But overall, the country, or if you look at the different ministers, there's a couple of most of sort of the right-wing heavyweights have been reconfirmed. Bruno Le Maire as finance minister, Gérald Darmanin as interior minister. Two sort of important right-wing figures have been demoted or have left. Blanquer, who has left the education ministry, who was sort of at the forefront in the whole culture war issues. Also, Vidal has left the government, who has also been tough in culture wars. And then some sort of new, rather left-wing figures, joining. I think probably the education ministry is the most interesting new position that has been filled.
Yeah, because that is a person of color appointed, Pape Ndiaye of Senegalese origin.
Yeah, I mean it's a sign in a sense, because Blanquer was really this guy about French universalism and this idea about Islamo-Gauchism and identity politics being a real problem. And now he has chosen as a successor someone who has, made his career as a historian, looking at the identity of the black minority in France, or also social protest in the US. So in a sense, if you want to look at this, this is quite a change. At least there's now someone who acknowledges these questions and knows them. And in a very important ministry, the education ministry is really important.
Because looking ahead to those legislative elections, the polarization, it's actually three ways. Because we talked earlier about, you talked about the far right perhaps winning the battle of ideas to a certain degree, or at least those ideas seeping into to the mainstream. There's also the hard left, and it's a hard left leader who's vying to become the next prime minister at the end of those legislative elections, should he win a majority.
Yeah, I mean, what is interesting is that Jean-Luc Mélenchon, he has, in his first reaction, he has said, the government is exactly the same as the previous, but he did say that the education minister, Papandia, is something he welcomes in this position. So, in a sense, if you want to argue, make the case that Macron's trying to pivot to the left a bit to get some votes, he might be doing this with Edith Cresson as prime minister and the new education minister, but overall, but overall, it is still, it has a lot of right-wing figures in there, a couple of center-left-wing figures. It's not a complete shift.
Neighboring Spain, throwing the spotlight on the fight for equality and women's rights. The government this week introducing a bill to allow medical leave paid by the state for women who suffer from severe period pains. That would be a first for Europe. It exists in places like Indonesia and South Korea. Periods will no longer be taboo, vowed Spanish Equality Minister Irene Montero, who hails from the far-left Podemos party. This to the delight of many on the streets of Barcelona.
It depends what job you have. If you have to move around a lot or stay standing up, you simply can't. Sometimes you simply can't work. And of course, you can't really avoid it because it's something women have every month. We cannot avoid it in any way. You end up working with the help of painkillers and anti-inflammatory medication. You don't have any other choice.
I think it's amazing. I think the work week was kind of invented for the man. And now that women have the ability, or could have the ability, to take some time off when they're going through these cycles, hormonal cycles, I think that's super amazing.
Vivian Walt, the work week was invented for the man, says that Canadian tourist in Barcelona.
I mean, we've spoken about this before, but I think the pandemic has really shaken up so many ideas about the workplace, the work week, what it means to go into an office every day. I think what's interesting about this, we spoke about the US. This was within a broader bill that was about reproductive rights, that was going to completely liberalize the access to abortion at the very moment when the US is going in the opposite direction. So I think it's great, and I hope that this sort of leads to more countries doing similar things.
And so you have at one end of Europe, Spain, which is talking about this bill for menstrual leave and for widening abortion rights. At the other end of Europe, Ukrainian refugees who are in Poland and who can't have an abortion.
Yes, Poland, you mentioned it. I want to say that democracy is always a fight, freedom is always a fight. And talking about parallel reality, why I said that nothing shocks me when I'm here in Europe is that because in Russia, a few years ago, they decriminalized domestic violence. They did make it not an offense anymore. So that's how the state of things are in Russia now, and that's the values that they defend, and that's what they want to push forward, is that the woman has to be at home, be a domestic good wife, don't argue with her husband, don't say anything about the problems she has in her, and preserve the family. That's what the mainstream mentality now is in Russia. You mentioned Poland also. Yes, women are fighting for their rights. They are, and also it goes back to the time when they have no right for abortion and so on. So democracy, and that's why elections in our countries also are very important. And preserve democracy and preserve freedom is very important, because when you have something to compare with and when you know what it can be, there you see that this is really important and really fragile for women, for blacks, for gays, for whoever, and just for people who want to be free.
Joseph de Wecke is these two Europes? Because we've been watching the polarization in the United States over reproductive rights. Is it the same problem in Europe?
Well, I think if you look at Europe sort of in a historical perspective on these issues over the last 30, 40 years, immense progress has been made, and there's a lot of backlash always. So in a sense, what we're seeing now in Poland or in other countries, you also see massive opposition. You know, for example, in Poland, the protestations against the reintroduction of abortion have been sort of one key moment where people go on the streets again and mobilize, you know, take on their civic duty to voice their thing. So in a sense, I think we're living in a time on many issues we're making big progress on societal issues, but there's also sparks always reaction. That's why we say reactionary forces. And but if you were to take a sort of big, grand historical perspective, you mostly see that these reactionary forces fight rearguard battles. Mm-hmm. They can take long, they can be violent, but ultimately, mostly they lose.
All right. 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, says Joseph Tvek. That'll be the last word for now. I want to thank you so much. I want to thank Vivian Walt, Craig Kapidis, Elena Voloshin. Thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.